Imagine walking into your boss's office to ask for a raise. You've brought all the data, you've, put in the hours.
You were totally ready to negotiate.
Right. But as you sit down, you realize your company's only two competitors in the entire city are, on speakerphone, just silently nodding in agreement to deny your request.
Which is a pretty terrifying thought.
It really is. I mean, you probably call that rigged. Economists, however, they just call it the modern labor market.
Yeah, that's just business as usual now.
So true. Welcome to the Impeach 47 podcast. Usually when you look at your monthly expenses, you just attribute rising costs to inflation or maybe just bad luck.
Right, the usual suspects.
Yeah. But in our reporting, we found a completely different force draining the wallets of American families. It's this hidden cost that you never voted for, but you pay it every single month.
And it adds up fast.
Oh, absolutely. We call it the monopoly tax. The mission for our deep dive today is to explore how 4 decades of corporate consolidation across everything from grocery chains to airlines to healthcare have just quietly rewritten the rules of the American economy.
It really has been a quiet takeover.
It has. We are going to show you why your hospital bills are climbing and why your wages might be artificially suppressed. As Impeach 47 journalists, we've really dug into the hard numbers here.
And it is entirely invisible until you look at the structure of the economy around you. It is built right into the receipts at the pharmacy, the prices at the checkout counter, and the deductions on your pay stub.
Yeah, it's everywhere.
Because when you look at the raw data from our reporting, the sheer scale of market concentration becomes just undeniable. We aren't dealing with a series of isolated corporate mergers here.
Right, it's bigger than that.
Way bigger.
Right.
We are dealing with a structural transformation of how business is actually done.
Let's start with the most visible place this monopoly tax shows up in daily life, which is the healthcare system.
Oh yeah, a huge one.
I mean, we spend a lot of time in this country talking about insurance deductibles and co-pays, but our reporting points to the actual physical structure of the hospital industry as a massive driver of those costs.
The shift in hospital ownership over the last few decades is just staggering. To give you a sense of scale, let's just look at the numbers.
Layoffs.
So in 1970, only 10% of American community hospitals were part of large health systems.
Just 1 in 10.
Right. They're mostly independent operations run locally, serving their specific communities. Fast forward to 2019, and that share had skyrocketed to 67%.
Oh, wow. That isn't just an industry trend. I mean, that is a fundamental reshaping of the landscape. It means the local independent hospital is practically extinct.
Spot on. The data shows that over that period, 3,436 hospitals were swallowed up by just 368 massive corporate systems.
That is wild.
And that consolidation did not happen in a vacuum. It happened because regulators essentially stepped aside and just let it happen.
Yeah, let's talk about the regulators, because this blew my mind. Between 2002 and 2020, there were 11,164 mergers of acute care hospitals in the United States.
A huge wave of consolidation.
Right. And out of those 1,164 mergers, the Federal Trade Commission took enforcement action against only 13.
Just 13.
13. Out of over 1,000. That is roughly a 1% intervention rate from the agency tasked with protecting consumers from monopolies.
It's hard to even process that.
I mean, if a bouncer only stopped 1 out of every 100 people walking out the front door of a store with a stolen television, they'd be fired by lunch.
Oh, absolutely.
The FTC basically waved through 99% of these massive structural changes to local healthcare markets without batting an eye.
And, the consequences for the consumer are severe.
Right.
Researchers found that this unchecked consolidation resulted in at least a 5% price increase in healthcare costs in those specific markets where the mergers went unchallenged.
Just an automatic 5% hike.
Right. To put that in perspective, think about a hypothetical town that has 3 competing hospitals. They have to compete for patients.
Which makes sense.
Right, which means they have to compete on the quality of care and the cost of procedures. But when a single massive health system buys all 3, that competition just evaporates.
Yeah, they own the whole board.
So the dominant system can essentially dictate prices to insurers. And what do insurers do? They pass those costs directly to you in the form of higher premiums.
Okay, let's unpack this. I am looking at these numbers and I am struggling to make sense of the logic we are always fed.
How so?
Well, every time 2 massive companies announce a merger, their PR teams promise us, streamlined efficiencies and massive savings.
Oh, always. That's the go-to line.
We always hear that they are going to cut administrative bloat and pass the savings down to the consumer. Wait, Aren't corporate mergers supposed to create efficiencies that lower costs? Why did our reporting find prices going up instead?
What's fascinating here is that without competition, the incentive to lower prices completely disappears.
Right.
Efficiency only benefits the consumer if a company is forced to compete for your business. If a health system owns the only 3 hospitals within a 50-mile radius, they don't have to offer better rates.
Because where else are you going to go?
Precisely. They don't have to entice you to walk through their doors. You have nowhere else to go. So yes, they might streamline their operations and they might cut administrative costs, but they keep the financial benefits of those so-called efficiencies for themselves.
So the consumer is left footing a higher bill simply because the market has been cornered.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense when you look at the bottom line.
But it isn't just hospitals buying other hospitals, right? Our reporting highlighted a massive surge in something called vertical integration.
You got it.
This is when hospitals start buying up independent physician practices. How does that change the equation for the average patient?
That is a really critical piece of the puzzle. Vertical integration is about owning the entire supply chain of a patient's care.
Like end-to-end control.
Right. A decade ago, the majority of doctors owned their own independent practices. Today, that has completely flipped. More than 75% of U.S. physicians are now employed by health systems or corporate entities.
Over 75%. So the vast majority of doctors are now essentially corporate employees?
Yes, they are. And when those independent doctors become corporate employees, the costs surge. We found that this specific form of vertical integration is associated with a 12% increase in marketplace insurance premiums.
Hold on, I'm paying 12% more for my insurance just because the underlying ownership of my local doctor's office changed hands from the physician to a corporate board.
That is the reality.
But the doctor's the same, the waiting room is the same, the stethoscope is the same, but the bill just jumps.
That is the monopoly tax in action right there.
Right.
When a corporate system buys a practice, they often start tacking on new facility fees just for walking into the building.
Oh, I hate those.
Yeah. Furthermore, they create an enclosed ecosystem. Your general practitioner is now heavily incentivized or outright mandated to refer you to a specialist within that same corporate network.
Who then sends you to an imaging center owned by that same network.
Exactly. It is a closed loop designed to extract maximum revenue, not provide efficient care. It is a premium you pay for a lack of competition in the medical sector.
So if these hospital monopolies don't have to compete for patients anymore, I'm guessing they also don't have to compete for the nurses, the technicians, and the doctors who work there. Does this price-fixing power bleed into people's paychecks?
It absolutely does. The discussion naturally moves from the prices you pay to the wages you earn.
Because it's two sides of the same coin.
Right, because concentrated market power impacts labor markets just as severely as consumer markets. In our reporting, we found that in highly concentrated industries, employers have so much leverage that they can mark down wages by 20 to 50% below what a competitive market would pay.
Wait, 50%? A 50% markdown on what your labor is actually worth?
Yes. Think about the mechanics of how that structural wage suppression works. When you are one of only 3 major employers in a region, you hold immense power over the local labor pool.
Because you're the only game in town.
Right. And the way they utilize that power today is incredibly sophisticated. These major employers share compensation benchmarking data through third-party software.
So it's like sitting down at a poker table where everyone's cards are facing straight up.
That's a good way to look at it.
If there are only 3 places to work in your field, in your city, and they all use the exact same software to see what the others are paying, none of them are going to offer a competitive premium to attract talent.
No, why would they?
Right, they don't need to hold shadowy backroom meetings in a smoke-filled room to collude on keeping wages low. The software algorithm and the market structure itself do the suppression for them.
Precisely. You have nowhere else to sell your labor, and they know it. And for decades, regulators largely ignored this dynamic.
They just looked the other way.
Well, they treated antitrust issues purely as a consumer price issue, ignoring the worker completely.
Yeah.
It wasn't until recently, in January 2025, that the FTC and the Department of Justice issued new antitrust guidelines that explicitly acknowledged this reality.
Finally.
Yeah, they finally stated that non-compete agreements and wage-fixing practices among competing firms are, in fact, antitrust violations. They put into writing that competition among employers helps workers through better wages and better benefits.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This completely flips the usual narrative we hear about corporate efficiency.
It really does.
We are often told that, seriously, If you're listening to this and wondering why your last promotion came with a tiny 2% bump, this is why. It's not your work ethic. It's the fact that your employer knows you literally have nowhere else in town to sell your skills.
But as our reporting noted regarding those 2025 FTC and DOJ guidelines, acknowledging the problem is only step one. Guidelines on a piece of paper are only as strong as the enforcement behind them.
Which brings us to a massive question. How did we get here? How did we get to a place where regulators miss 99% of hospital mergers and wages can be suppressed by up to 50% without anyone blowing the whistle?
It didn't happen overnight.
Right. To understand this, we have to look at when the rules of the game actually changed.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to trace this back to the 1980s.
Yeah.
Beginning in the Reagan era, regulators adopted a philosophy known as the Chicago School Antitrust Framework.
Hold on. Chicago School sounds like a pretty dense economics textbook term. In plain English, how did regulators in the 80s actually change the rule book?
Before the 1980s, regulators looked at a variety of factors when deciding whether to block a merger. They looked at the impact on local communities, they looked at how it would affect smaller suppliers, and they looked at whether it would give a company too much political or structural power.
Sounds like a pretty holistic approach.
It was, but the Chicago School Framework reoriented antitrust law around one single highly restricted metric:
Which was?
immediate consumer prices. Under this new philosophy, if a corporate merger did not cause an overnight price spike for the consumer, regulators essentially let it pass.
So it was a massive narrowing of what regulators were allowed to care about. By focusing solely on that short-term price tag, they systematically ignored everything else.
That's at the core of it.
Imagine two massive grocery chains want to merge. Under the old rules, regulators might say, no, this will destroy local farmers who supply you, and it will hurt the truck drivers.
Right.
But under the Chicago School rules, if the price of a gallon of milk doesn't go up the very next day, the merger gets rubber stamped. They ignored the long-term impacts on workers.
And whole communities.
Yeah. Industries that used to be fragmented and competitive, from meat packing to local media, were allowed to consolidate into just a few massive players.
And the data shows the long-term consequence of that specific shift. We looked at findings from the Economic Policy Institute, which tracks the massive divergence between worker productivity and median pay.
This is a really telling metric.
It is. From the end of World War II until the late 1970s, as American workers became more productive, their pay rose at roughly the same rate. The lines on the graph moved together.
So if you worked harder and faster, you got paid more.
Right. But since 1979, productivity has continued to climb sharply, while median pay has largely stagnated.
Meaning we as workers are producing way more value per hour today than we did in the 70s, largely because of computers and technology, but our paychecks are stuck in neutral.
Yep.
Where did all that extra value go?
Our reporting found that the Economic Policy Institute traces 55% of that divergence to three main factors:
Okay, what are they?
excessive unemployment policies, eroded collective bargaining, and corporate-driven globalization. And concentrated markets, which are the direct result of that Chicago School Framework we just talked about, made all three of those negative dynamics significantly worse.
So it acted like an amplifier for all these issues.
Yes. When corporations hold monopoly power, workers lose the leverage they need to demand their fair share of the productivity they're actually creating.
I am trying to wrap my head around the scale of this. So was this an accident? Was this just a natural, inevitable evolution of the free market over 40 years? Or was this a deliberate policy choice by regulators who knew what they were doing?
The historical record shows it was a deliberate policy choice.
Yeah.
The antitrust rollback was highly intentional.
Wow.
Yeah. The post-war American economic model, which produced the broadest wage growth and the greatest expansion of the middle class in U.S. history, did not just happen by magic. It was actively built on stringent antitrust enforcement, strong labor market competition, and robust public investment.
So they actually managed it.
Right. Regulators actively police the market to ensure multiple companies had to compete. When regulators consciously chose to change that policy in the 1980s and put on the Chicago school blinders, the economic outcomes for the American middle class changed right along with it.
So we are dealing with a clearly diagnosed issue here. We know that corporate consolidation is draining wallets, and we know that the adoption of the Chicago School Framework is what allowed it to spread unchecked.
We have the diagnosis, yes.
Now we have to look at the cure. If the current system is suppressing wages by 50% and driving up hospital bills, how do we actually fix the structure of the market?
This raises an important question, because when people hear about problems this massive, they assume the solution requires tearing down the entire economy.
Which sounds exhausting.
It does, but it doesn't require that. The solution is not some untested radical proposition. The balanced alternative is actually just a return to the regulated markets and active antitrust enforcement that the United States successfully utilized for most of the 20th century.
Just going back to what worked.
Exactly. It is the same framework that most other wealthy democracies maintain today.
The prescription laid out in our reporting is highly specific and practical. First, regulators need to preemptively block anti-competitive mergers before they happen.
That's a huge step.
Right now, the government often tries to fight these battles in court years after the merger has already taken place. The hospitals have already combined, and the damage to the market is done.
And it is incredibly difficult to unscramble an egg.
Great way to put it. Stopping them before the ink dries prevents the monopoly tax from being levied in the first place.
Second, we need to aggressively address the labor side of the equation. That means rigorously enforcing existing laws against wage fixing and non-compete agreements.
Which the new guidelines touch on.
Right. We need to crack down on the algorithmic benchmarking tools that allow companies to implicitly collude on salaries. We have to ensure workers aren't trapped in underpaying jobs simply because the major employers are coordinating their pay scales.
And the final component outlined in the research is restoring collective bargaining rights. If workers have robust countervailing power, meaning they can negotiate as a unified group, they can demand fair wages even when they are operating within highly concentrated corporate markets.
None of these steps require dismantling capitalism or inventing a brand new economic theory.
No, not at all.
They simply require using the tools that are already written into the law, tools that regulators voluntarily abandoned 40 years ago.
So what does this all mean? It means the problem is entirely solvable. We don't have to accept a 1% intervention rate from the FTC. Regulators just need to pick up the tools they dropped.
That's it.
They need to enforce the rules of competition rather than letting a handful of massive corporations dictate the terms of our economy and shrink your paycheck.
And that leaves us with a final thought to consider. If regulators spent the last 4 decades stepping aside and letting corporations write the rules of competition, take a hard look at your monthly expenses tonight.
Yeah, run the numbers.
Look at your rent, your internet bill, your grocery receipts, and your healthcare premiums. Ask yourself, how much of your daily life and how much of your financial stress is really just a monopoly tax in disguise?
This has been independent, unfiltered accountability reporting from Impeach 47. We don't have corporate owners dictating what we can cover, and we don't put this vital information behind a paywall.
We rely on the facts.
If this reporting is useful to you, the way you support us is simple. We're the movement. Every piece of gear is a walking billboard that keeps this research fed.
So true.
Get your gear and support the research at impeach47.earth. Subscribe to the newsletter at impeach47.substack.com. Follow us on X at @impeach47. Follow us on Threads at @impeach.47. Follow us on Instagram at @impeach.47. And subscribe on YouTube at @impeach47.